The wind screamed down Main Street like it had a personal grudge against the town. Snow fell sideways in thick, icy sheets coating the sidewalks, burying street signs and turning every breath into white smoke. Chris Bennett pulled his hoodie tighter under his work coat and leaned into the gust, one gloved hand, clutching a cardboard box taped up with care. Inside were photos, a jar of homemade jam, and a handwritten letter from his daughter Lily. A Christmas care package bound for Tucson, Arizona. Addressed to a woman who most days no longer remembered her own birthday. He was late. The post office was supposed to close at noon, and his shift at St. Luke's Hospital hadn't ended until 11:35. He'd driven too fast, cursed the icy roads, skidded into the shared lot between the post office and the Greyhound station, and sprinted through the slush like a man chasing something more than just a deadline. Maybe he was. By the time the clerk took the box with a half smile and a "You just made it," Chris could barely feel his fingers. He thanked her, stepped back outside, and stopped short. The cold punched him in the lungs. His first thought, get to the car, crank the heat. His second thought, pick up the kids from Linda's, throw the ham in the oven, fake your way through another Merry Christmas. And then his third thought hit like a brick to the chest. They shouldn't be out here. There across the lot, just outside the Greyhound station, sat an elderly couple. The kind of metal bench designed specifically to discourage comfort. Thin slats, no cushions, and no kindness. The man had removed his coat, draping it over the woman's shoulders, his arms crossed tight over a flannel shirt. His face was drawn, weathered eyes locked on the concrete in front of him. The woman was smaller, thinner, shivering violently. Her white hair was pinned neatly, though the wind had pulled strands loose. Her lips were tinged blue. Chris blinked against the snow. People past them rushed, heads down, arms full of gifts or groceries or regret, but no one stopped. No one even slowed down. He almost kept walking. Almost. But then the woman reached for the man's sleeve with trembling fingers, and he instinctively shifted, leaning toward her like a shield. Like Marcus used to do. Chris's stomach turned. The bench, the cold, the way that man's body curled protectively around his wife, it was too familiar. Too close to the waiting room at St. Luke's 8 months ago. The memory of the nurse gently guiding Chris into a hallway to say, "We did everything we could." He didn't remember how he crossed the lot, only that the snow was up to his ankles and the wind clawed at his face. When he stopped in front of them, the man looked up, startled. The woman didn't lift her eyes. She was crying, but the tears had frozen in place. "Excuse me," Chris said. "Are you folks okay?" The man's jaw clenched. "We're fine." He wasn't defensive. He was embarrassed. "How long have you been out here?" Chris asked. The woman answered without looking up. Her voice was small, brittle. "Since 5 this morning." Chris glanced at his phone. It was 12:18 p.m. 7 hours. In sub-freezing temperatures. On Christmas Eve. The man shifted. "We're waiting for our son. He's late." Chris crouched, trying to meet the woman's eyes. "Ma'am, you're shaking. Please let me take you inside the diner. Just for coffee to warm up. I'll even pay." The woman opened her mouth, hesitated. What if Kevin comes and we're not here? The man, Kevin's father, clearly placed a hand gently over hers. His voice softened. "He's not coming, Mabel." She flinched as if the truth was colder than the snow around her. Chris stood. He didn't have to think about it anymore. "Come on," he said. "There's heat inside. Let's just sit down, figure this out together." They hesitated. Chris didn't wait for permission. He reached down, lifted Mabel's suitcase, then the other. They weighed almost nothing. "Please," he said. Walter the man finally nodded. "If you insist." Inside Rosie's diner, warmth rushed over them like a blanket. The smell of bacon and coffee hit Chris hard. He hadn't eaten since his 5 a.m. break. But it wasn't hunger that made his hands shake. It was the look on Mabel's face when she touched the warm mug the waitress set in front of her. Like it was the first time in hours she believed she might still exist. Chris sat across from them, coat still zipped, heart pounding. He didn't know what the hell he was doing, but he knew this: you don't leave people outside in 20-degree weather, not on Christmas Eve. They sipped their coffee in silence for a few minutes. The diner was half empty. A few regulars, a man reading a paper, a waitress humming to "Have Yourself a Merry Little Christmas." "Where were you supposed to go?" Chris asked quietly. Walter cleared his throat. "Our son said he was moving us in with him. Said he sold the house, would pick us up here and bring us to Portland. And he called at 6 this morning. Said plans changed. He couldn't do it anymore. That we were too much." Chris didn't speak, didn't have the words. Mabel finally looked up. Her eyes were glassy but clear. "We raised him. For 40 years, we were his whole world. And now, he told us to figure something else out," Walter said. His voice cracked on the last word. Chris leaned back, processing. The rage came first, then sorrow, then a terrifying realization they have nowhere else to go. He glanced outside. His Civic was parked in the snow. His kids would be waiting at Linda's. The ham, the Christmas lights, the gift Lily left for Santa, and two strangers wrapped in each other's pain had just become his responsibility. Maybe it was crazy. Maybe it was grief. Maybe it was exactly what Marcus would have done. He took a deep breath. Okay, here's what's going to happen. Chris didn't speak until they were halfway down Franklin Avenue, the heater in his car blasting full tilt. Walter sat in the back seat, upright and stiff like a man being driven to a funeral, while Mabel curled into the corner, her coat wrapped tight around her like armor. Chris stole a glance in the rearview mirror. They looked like they hadn't slept, hadn't eaten. They looked like they'd been abandoned. Because they had. The silence in the car felt brittle, like one wrong word would crack it wide open. "I've got 2 kids," Chris said, finally keeping his eyes on the road. "Aiden's 10, Lily's 7. We lost my wife earlier this year. Car accident." Neither of them responded right away. Then Mabel whispered, "I'm sorry." Chris nodded, though she couldn't see it. "I just figured, if someone had stopped for her, if she'd been stranded, scared. God, I would have wanted someone to stop." He didn't expect a reply. He wasn't saying it for them, really. He was saying it to the ache in his own chest. When they pulled into his driveway, a small ranch-style home with a sagging fence and a lopsided snowman in the yard, Mabel looked up. "It's lovely," she murmured, almost in disbelief. Chris smiled tightly. "It's not much, but it's warm, and tonight that's enough." Inside, the house smelled like pine needles and gingerbread. The tree glowed in the corner, real and crooked, just the way Lily had insisted. Wrapped presents sat neatly beneath it, their edges curled from too much tape. As Chris guided them into the living room, the front door slammed open behind them. Daddy Lily barreled in her curly hair, wild under her Santa hat, followed by Aiden, slower, more watchful. "Whoa," Chris said, catching Lily mid-run. "We've got company." The kids stared. Walter straightened slightly. Mabel clutched her purse like it might disappear if she let go. "These are Mr. Walter and Ms." Mabel, Chris explained gently. "They'll be staying with us tonight. Just tonight." Aiden's eyes flicked between them. He didn't say a word. Lily, on the other hand, stepped forward and grinned. "Do you like Christmas cookies? 'Cause we made like 1,000. Mabel smiled. It was small, but real. I've always loved Christmas. Aiden raised an eyebrow, but still said nothing. Chris sent Lily to wash up and gave Aiden a look, "Be kind." Aiden gave a half nod in return, the best you could hope for from a kid who still talked to his dad's flannel shirt like it might answer. He set Mabel and Walter up in the den with hot tea, then stepped into the kitchen to check the oven. The ham wasn't done, but close. Mashed potatoes were next. He pulled a chair out and collapsed into it, elbows on the table. What the hell was he doing, bringing strangers home on Christmas Eve? With his kids, with his grief still raw and bleeding just beneath the surface. "Chris," a voice came from behind him. Walter stood at the doorway, the tea trembling in his hand. "You didn't have to do this," he said. "You really didn't." Chris shook his head. "Yeah, I did." Walter looked like he wanted to say more, but didn't. He turned back down the hallway, shoulders sagging. Dinner was quiet. Not uncomfortable, but not quite easy either. Lily chattered enough for everyone, filling the silence with stories about school and Santa and the weird kid who ate glue. Mabel listened with rapt attention, as if each word was a lifeline. Walter answered questions when asked. Aiden remained mostly silent, picking at his mashed potatoes. It wasn't until after dinner, when the kids went to play, that Chris sat with Walter on the front porch. The snow had stopped, but the air was still sharp. "She has early-stage dementia," Walter said suddenly out of nowhere. Chris glanced sideways. Walter nodded. "It's not bad yet. Comes and goes. But it's getting worse. She forgets names sometimes, places, what year it is." "I'm sorry," Chris said quietly. Walter shrugged. "I thought Eric would help. I really did." Chris didn't push, just let the silence breathe for a moment. Then Walter spoke again. "He sold the house," he said. "The one I built with my own 2 hands. Told us it was time to move in with him and Tracy. Said we'd be closer to the grandkids, that he'd handle everything." Chris frowned. And then Walter's laugh was hollow. "Then he put us on a bus. Said he'd meet us in Boise. We waited, called him, and this morning, he told us he couldn't do it anymore." Chris's jaw tightened. He said what Walter looked down at his hands. "You said we were too much, that we should figure something else out." Chris stared out at the dark yard, the string of mismatched Christmas lights glowing like distant planets. "That's—" He couldn't finish. It was too cruel to name. Walter nodded like he already knew what Chris meant. "He wasn't always like this. He used to help me in the garage. Built his first birdhouse with me when he was 7. Chris swallowed hard. "My boy Aiden, he said he started one with his mom, before she died. He never finished it." Walter looked over. "Maybe he and I could do it together. If we're still around tomorrow." Chris didn't respond. Not right away. Because something inside him, a wall maybe, was shifting. He could feel it. "You're welcome to stay," he said. "For Christmas. Beyond if needed. We'll figure it out." Walter didn't thank him. He just nodded, and in that nod was something deeper than gratitude. A kind of reluctant hope. Inside, Mabel and Lily sat by the fire singing Jingle Bells off-key. Aiden stood nearby, watching, not joining in, but not walking away either. Later that night, after everyone was settled, Chris lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. His mind raced. He'd made a choice, one he couldn't undo. He'd opened his door, his home, his heart. Tomorrow would bring questions, maybe problems, maybe worse. But for tonight, it was Christmas Eve, and no one was sleeping on a frozen bench. He didn't know it yet, but outside of town, on the other end of a phone call, someone was already watching. The next morning, a post would go online. A photo. a name. A single act of kindness that would ripple far wider than Chris could imagine. Chris woke to the scent of cinnamon and something else he couldn't quite place, warm, nostalgic, and familiar in a way that made his chest ache. It took a few seconds for his brain to catch up. It was Christmas morning. A year ago, he would have woken up to Marcus humming carols in the kitchen, wearing that ridiculous apron that said, "I bake it, you break it." Now the house felt different. Not empty, not quite, but definitely changed. He sat up, rubbed his face, and listened. There were soft voices in the kitchen, and laughter. He slipped on a flannel shirt, padded down the hallway barefoot, and peeked into the living room. The tree lights still glowed faintly in the early light, reflecting off the scattered wrapping paper from last night's gift exchange. Lily had insisted on opening one present before bed. The kids had fallen asleep on the couch, halfway through The Grinch. In the kitchen, he found Mabel at the stove wearing one of his wife's aprons. He'd forgotten it was still hanging behind the door. Her hair was up, hands moving confidently as she flipped something in the skillet. Walter sat at the table with Lily sipping coffee. Aidan stood nearby watching Mabel with cautious curiosity. "Morning," Chris said, voice still gravelly. "Morning, Daddy," Lily chirped. "Mabel's making French toast, real French toast." Mabel turned, smiling softly. "I hope that's all right. I found eggs and cinnamon in the fridge. Didn't mean to take over." Chris shook his head. "It's more than all right. Smells like a 5-star Christmas breakfast in here." Walter chuckled. "She hasn't cooked like this in years." Mabel beamed, then paused, frowning faintly. "It felt right this morning, like something told me I needed to." Chris moved toward the coffee pot, poured himself a cup, and sat at the table. Something probably did. Breakfast was loud in the way Christmas mornings should be: sticky fingers, too much syrup, Lily telling Walter the entire plot of Home Alone between bites. Even Aidan cracked a smile when Mabel offered him an extra slice with powdered sugar snow on top. Afterward, they all moved to the living room. Chris handed out presents quietly, adding 2 small ones he'd wrapped in a hurry after the kids went to bed. He hadn't planned on gifts for Walter and Mabel, but something about their presence had demanded it. Walter opened his first, a soft wool scarf in charcoal gray. He ran his hands over it with a reverence Chris didn't expect. "This is—" "Thank you," he murmured. Mabel's was a new pair of slippers, fuzzy and red with little pom-poms. She slipped them on immediately. "These are perfect," she said. "My feet haven't been this warm in days." Walter reached into his coat pocket, hesitating. "We didn't come with much, but—" He pulled out a small wooden box, hand-carved smooth at the edges. "Aidan, this is for you." Aidan blinked. "Me," Walter nodded. "Something I made a long time ago. It's a whistle. Works better than it looks." Aidan turned it over in his hands, then blew softly. A clear, sweet note floated through the room. Mabel smiled. "You have your mother's hands," she said to Lily, handing her something wrapped in tissue paper. "I hope you'll like this." Inside was a delicate knit scarf, cream-colored, soft and thin. Lily's eyes lit up. "It's so pretty." Chris felt something shift in the room then. The space between strangers narrowing. The warmth pushing out the cold inch by inch. After gifts. Mabel sat beside Lily on the couch, helping her braid yarn into her doll's hair. Walter wandered into the garage with Aidan, the 2 of them gone long enough to make Chris curious. When he checked on them, he found Aidan standing over the old workbench, hands on a dusty birdhouse frame. "I never finished it," Aidan said quietly. "Me and Mom started it before." Walter stepped beside him. "Would you want to?" Aidan shrugged, but it wasn't a no. "I've got time," Walter said. Plenty of it if you do. Chris watched from the doorway as they started pulling out tools, Aiden asking questions, Walter answering patiently. Something inside Chris eased something he hadn't realized was still clenched. Back inside, Chris caught Mabel staring at the tree. She reached out and touched an ornament handmade slightly crooked. She would have loved this, she said softly. Who? Chris asked. My daughter. She died young. Long before Eric ever came along. We used to make ornaments like that every year. Handmade or nothing. It's why I never liked the fake trees Eric used. Too perfect. Too clean. Chris didn't know what to say, so he said nothing. Thank you, she added after a pause, for letting us be here, even just for a day. Chris looked at her, really looked. You don't need to thank me. It's Christmas. Sometimes kindness is the only miracle we get. Mabel's eyes shined, but she blinked quickly and turned away. That evening, while Chris was outside shoveling the walk, Mrs. Ramirez came by with a plate of tamales wrapped in foil and still warm. I saw the folks staying with you, she said with a wink. You got a big heart, Chris. He laughed, suddenly shy. It's nothing, really. It's not nothing, she said. That kind of thing. That's rare. That's why I posted about it. He stopped shoveling, posted. She pulled out her phone, tapping quickly. The neighborhood Facebook group. Just a little story about what you did, a few photos. Thought it might remind folks what Christmas is really about. Chris froze. Wait, photos. Don't worry, nothing bad. Just a shot I took from my porch. You helping them out of your car? It's sweet. He tried to keep his voice even. Can you take it down? She looked surprised. You don't want people to know it's not about attention, Chris said. I just didn't ask them. I don't want to make things worse. Mrs. Ramirez gave him a long look. Chris, you did a good thing, and good things deserve to be shared. She handed him the tamales and walked off. Later that night, after everyone had gone to bed, Chris sat at the kitchen table, phone in hand. Curiosity got the best of him. He opened the group page. The post had already been shared over 50 times. Dozens of comments. One stuck out. Isn't that Walter Green, Eric Green's father, from Green Realty in Portland? Chris stared at the name. Then another comment appeared below it. I worked with Eric. If that's really his parents, something's not right. Chris set the phone down. He didn't like the direction this was heading. In the morning, he'd find out just how fast a private act of kindness could turn public, and just how many people were paying attention. Because in Chapter 4, strangers become witnesses, and pasts refuse to stay buried. The morning after Christmas, Chris woke to the sound of a hammer tapping in the garage. At first, he thought he was dreaming. But then came the unmistakable scrape of wood shifting against wood, followed by the muffled sound of Walter's voice, low, steady, instructional. Chris rolled out of bed, rubbing his face. The house was quiet otherwise. Mabel was still asleep on the pull-out sofa in the den. Lily was curled up in her room, one leg hanging off the bed like a starfish. Aiden's door was open. The garage light was on. Chris opened the door and stepped inside. The cold hit him immediately, but so did something warmer, a scene that stopped him in his tracks. Aiden stood at the workbench, safety goggles too big for his face, holding a small handsaw in both hands. Walter stood beside him, pointing, guiding. A half-built birdhouse sat on the bench, along with a handful of tools Chris hadn't seen used in over a year. Marcus had been the one to teach Aiden the basics. They'd started that birdhouse project together, plans printed from Pinterest wood, bought on sale from Home Depot. It had sat unfinished in the corner since the funeral. Too painful to throw away. Too painful to finish. Until now. Chris didn't interrupt. He stood quietly, just listening. You don't need to press hard, Walter was saying. Let the blade do the work. Just follow the line. Aiden nodded, focused. After a few minutes, Walter glanced up and noticed Chris. He gave a small wave. Chris waved back, his throat thick. Later, as the sun started warming the frost off the windows, Chris returned with 2 mugs of hot cocoa, one for Aiden, one for Walter. Figured you could use a break, he said. Aiden took his without a word, but didn't go far. He sat on a stool, sipping, eyes still on the birdhouse. He's a fast learner, Walter said, flexing his fingers. Doesn't talk much, but he listens. That's rare. Chris nodded. He's been quiet. Since. Walter didn't ask what since meant. He didn't need to. Chris took a breath. I haven't seen him smile like that since the funeral. Walter looked over at Aiden, who was gently sanding a small panel of wood. Grief carves out a space in us, he said. Sometimes it feels like nothing will ever fill it again. But sometimes a piece fits. Just not the one you expected. Chris didn't answer, but he stayed. Back inside, Mabel sat at the kitchen table, slowly buttering toast. She moved a little slower this morning, eyes a bit glassier. Chris poured her a cup of tea. Sleep okay? She nodded. Had the nicest dream. My daughter was still alive. We were baking. Flour everywhere. Chris didn't know much about her daughter. Walter had only mentioned her once, but something about the way Mabel said it made him ache. Sounds like a good dream, he said. Mabel looked up. It was. But when I woke up, I couldn't remember her name for a second. Just gone. Like a balloon you let go of. Chris sat beside her. It came back, though, she nodded slowly. Eventually. Still, it scares me. What else is slipping away without me even noticing? He reached across the table and touched her hand. You're not going through it alone. She gave him a small, grateful smile. Later that afternoon, Chris finally checked his phone. He'd avoided social media all morning, but curiosity got the better of him. Mrs. Ramirez's post had exploded. Over 200 shares now, dozens of comments. People praising the single dad with a heart of gold, others debating whether it was actually Eric Green's parents. And then he saw it, someone had tagged Eric. Chris's stomach dropped. The comments had shifted in tone, less heartwarming, more invasive. Why would Eric Green leave his folks at a bus stop? Has anyone contacted the authorities? Someone's lying. He set the phone down and rubbed his eyes. This wasn't what he wanted. He hadn't done this to get noticed. The last thing he needed was this turning into some kind of public circus. He called Miles. Hey, his friend answered. Saw the post. You famous now, don't start. Chris groaned. Miles laughed, then sobered. Listen, I did a quick check. There's no missing persons report or anything but your guy Eric. He's got money and connections. You should be careful. Chris sighed. This was supposed to be simple. It never is, man, Miles said. But you did the right thing. Just be ready in case someone tries to twist it. Chris glanced toward the den where Mabel was dozing. You think he'll show up? If he's smart, he'll stay quiet. But if he's got something to lose, yeah, I think he'll come knocking. Chris hung up and leaned back against the wall. Things were moving faster than he liked. That evening, as the kids played in the living room and the smell of soup filled the air, Walter sat beside Chris at the dining table. I saw the post, he said quietly. Chris blinked. You're on Facebook. Walter gave a crooked smile. Mabel insisted we learn, said we needed to stay connected to the grandkids. Chris chuckled, but the laugh died quickly. You okay with it? He asked. Walter hesitated. It's strange. Seeing our story out there makes me feel exposed. I can ask her to take it down." Walter shook his head. "No. Maybe it's time people knew. What Eric did, what he's still doing, it wasn't just a mistake. It was a choice. One he keeps making." Chris studied him. "You want to talk about it?" Walter nodded slowly. "Just not tonight." Chris understood. They didn't need to rush it, but the wheels were turning. The story was spreading, and Chris could feel it in his gut this wouldn't stay quiet much longer. Before bed, Aiden showed Chris the birdhouse. "It's not perfect," he mumbled. Chris crouched down and ran his hand over the smooth wood. "It's better than perfect. You finished it." Aiden's face twitched something between pride and confusion. "Walter said we could make another one. Something more complicated." Chris smiled. "That sound good to you?" Aiden nodded. "Yeah, I think it does." Chris hugged him tight. Aiden didn't pull away. Outside, the night was clear and bitterly cold. But inside, something had shifted. Something real was taking root. But by morning, the outside world would come knocking, loud, unapologetic, and ready to question everything. The sky was barely shifting from gray to pale when Chris opened the front door and nearly tripped over the small stack of mail and a plate of muffins. A folded note sat on top in floral handwriting. "Thank you for reminding this town what humanity looks like. D from the florist." He stood there for a beat, cold creeping into his socks, staring at the note like it might vanish if he blinked. Then he scooped it up, tucked it under his arm, and brought it inside. The muffins weren't the first thing people had dropped off. Since Christmas, the porch had become a kind of unofficial donation station. Canned goods, blankets, even an envelope with gas cards. People wanted to help. They didn't know exactly how, but they wanted to be part of something good. Chris understood the impulse. Still, it made him uneasy. Not because of the kindness, but because kindness never came without attention. And attention never came without scrutiny. At breakfast, Lily was already halfway through a muffin before anyone could ask where she got it. Aiden was more reserved, pushing his food around, eyes flicking toward Walter. Mabel, seated across the table with a tea mug between her palms, looked especially lucid today. She even braided Lily's hair before breakfast, humming something soft under her breath. Walter read the local paper with the calm focus of a man trying to stay one step ahead of bad news. Chris poured coffee. "So, the post. It's been shared over 500 times now." Walter didn't look up, I figured. Miles said people are tagging Eric in the comments. Now Walter did look up. "That's faster than I expected." Chris hesitated. "You think he'll come?" "I know my son Walter," said quietly. "If he feels like his reputation is at risk, yes. He'll come." Aiden, sitting nearby, finally spoke. "What if he tries to take you away?" Walter gave him a soft, sad smile. "He doesn't get to decide where I go anymore." The words hung in the air, heavy but sure. After breakfast, Walter and Aiden retreated to the garage. The next project, a new birdhouse, this one with a small sliding roof and a perch designed to spin in the wind. Chris went back inside, opened his laptop, and logged on to Facebook. The original post had now gone statewide. Someone had submitted it to a regional news outlet. The headline was blunt: "Single dad gives elderly couple a second chance at Christmas." His phone buzzed. Miles. "You might want to sit down," Miles said by way of greeting. Chris dropped into a chair. "Please don't say lawsuit." "Not yet, but you've been officially mentioned by name in a comment thread on a Portland real estate forum. A former co-worker of Eric's says he's dealing with a personal situation involving family manipulation and a custody dispute." Chris rubbed his eyes. Custody, like their pets. Miles exhaled. "He's controlling the narrative. It's what guys like him do. Make you look like the problem before anyone asks what happened. Chris clicked over to the post again. Someone had commented, "Why hasn't anyone called Adult Protective Services?" "This seems shady," another replied. "Why would you take in two strangers with no legal documentation? Sounds like a setup." The warm fuzzies were fading, fast, and then a private message popped up from someone named Tracy Green. He stared at it for a moment, heart beating faster. He clicked. "Hi, I'm Eric's wife." Or, "I was. We're separated. I saw the post. I just want you to know not everyone in his life agrees with what he did." Chris stared. Then another message. "If you'll talk to me, I'll explain. I think you need to know what you're dealing with." That afternoon, as snow began to fall again in soft spirals, Chris told Walter about the message. Walter nodded. "I remember Tracy. She was never the problem." Chris messaged her back. They agreed to talk by phone. Tracy answered on the second ring. Her voice was calm, but tired. "I've been trying to keep quiet for months," she said. "But after that post went viral, Eric lost it. He's talking to lawyers. He's spinning this like you kidnapped them." Chris's jaw clenched. "They walked into my house." I know that she said quickly. "I believe that. But Eric's obsessed with how it looks. He doesn't want people questioning why his parents are living with a stranger instead of him. He's already telling people you're using them for publicity." Chris laughed bitterly. "Yeah, I'm really enjoying all the attention." There was a pause. Then she said, "I think you should get ahead of it. Tell your side, before he controls the whole story." Chris was quiet for a long time. "They're not just a story. I know," she said. "That's why I'm calling. Because the man I married wouldn't have left them out there. But the man he's become, he's dangerous, Chris. Not physically, but legally, financially. He plays dirty, and he plays to win." Chris thanked her. After they hung up, he sat in the quiet and stared at the snow falling outside. It was beautiful, and quiet, and deceptive. That night, he gathered the family in the living room, Walter, Mabel, the kids. "I need to ask something," he said. "Are you okay with people knowing what happened? The real story?" Walter looked at Mabel. She nodded slowly, her hand resting on his. "We've been quiet for too long," Walter said. "Let's tell it." Chris posted the next morning. It wasn't flashy. No hashtags, no dramatic music. Just a photo of Walter and Aiden holding the finished birdhouse, and a caption. "He was a stranger on a bench. Now he's teaching my son how to build again. My only agenda is kindness. If that's controversial, I can live with it." Within an hour, it had over 1,000 likes. But it wasn't the comments that struck Chris, it was the shares. People reposting with their own stories about caring for aging parents, about family estrangement, about what it means to do the right thing when no one's watching. Mrs. Ramirez knocked that afternoon, holding her phone. "You saved them," she said, eyes misty. "The whole town should know." Chris smiled, but something in his gut twisted. Because with every person who supported them, there was another digging for weakness. And before long, one of those people would come knocking with claims, accusations, and legal muscle. The knock came just before noon. 3 sharp raps, precise and deliberate, like someone used to being obeyed. Chris was in the kitchen rinsing dishes while the kids colored at the table. He froze, mid-motion, water running over his hands, and looked toward the door like it might explode open. Walter had just stepped in from the garage. Mabel was napping in the den. Chris glanced at him. Walter's face had gone pale. "Is it him?" Chris asked. Walter didn't answer. He didn't need to. Chris dried his hands and walked slowly to the door. For a second, he considered not opening it, just waiting him out. But that wasn't the kind of man he wanted to be. That wasn't the kind of father he was trying to teach Aiden to be. He opened the door. Eric Green stood there, tall, pressed, polished. His jacket looked expensive, his hair too neat for Idaho wind. His smile was thin, not warm, the kind of smile you wear to courtrooms and fundraising galas. "Chris Bennett," he said. "Mind if I come in?" Chris didn't move. "Why are you here, Eric?" Let the silence stretch for a moment, as if it made him more powerful. "You've got something that belongs to me." Chris raised an eyebrow. "Your parents aren't property." Eric gave a tight laugh. "Look, I don't want to make this ugly. I just want to get them somewhere more appropriate." Chris crossed his arms. "Define appropriate." "Back in Portland," Eric said. "In a care facility, one with resources, full-time staff, Alzheimer's specialists. Not whatever this is." Chris stared him down. "You mean a place you don't have to visit, or maybe a place you can control with a monthly check instead of a conversation?" Eric's smile vanished. "I'm trying to handle this respectfully," he said. "But I've already spoken to a lawyer. If you don't cooperate, I'll get the authorities involved. Guardianship hearings, elder endangerment reports. You're not exactly operating under the law here." Chris stepped outside, pulling the door mostly closed behind him so the kids wouldn't hear. "You're welcome to try," he said. "But Walter and Mabel aren't wards of the state. They made a choice." I opened my door. "That's it." Eric's jaw clenched. "They're not thinking clearly. You're exploiting them." Chris barked a laugh. "You left them at a bus stop in 20-degree weather on Christmas Eve. I'm not sure you're the expert on what's best for them." Eric looked past him toward the house. "Where's my father?" "Inside," Chris said, "with his grandson, building something." Eric scoffed. "You think this changes anything? You think teaching a kid to swing a hammer earns you moral high ground?" Chris didn't blink. "No, but it makes me a hell of a lot better than the guy who drove off and never looked back." Eric's hand twitched at his side. He took a breath, composed himself again. "Let me be clear," he said. "If they're not on a plane back to Oregon by the end of the week, I'll take legal action. You think the internet's on your side now? Wait till they see the full story." Chris leaned in slightly. "You don't get to abandon someone and still control how their story gets told." Eric held his gaze for a second longer, then turned and walked to his car without another word. Chris stood on the porch, watching him go. Only when the SUV disappeared around the corner did he exhale. Behind him, the door creaked open. Walter stood there, one hand on the frame. His face was stone. "I heard everything he said." Chris nodded slowly. "You okay?" Walter stepped outside, arms crossed against the chill. He's always been good at making people think he's the victim. That's what he's doing now, getting ahead of the truth, bending it until it breaks. Chris studied him. "You want to fight Walter," looked at him, something hard but determined in his eyes. "I want to speak." That night they sat at the kitchen table with a camera propped on a stack of books. Chris hit record and stepped back. Walter and Mabel sat side by side, hands clasped. Walter spoke first. "My name is Walter Green. My wife is Mabel. We've been married 47 years. We raised a son named Eric. This is what happened." There was no anger in his voice, just steady, deliberate truth. He spoke of the move, of the promises, of the abandonment. He spoke of Mabel's illness, of his fear, of the betrayal, and finally, of Chris. "He didn't know us," Walter said, "but he saw us, and he didn't look away. That's all any of us really want, to not be invisible," Mabel added softly. "I forgot my daughter's name last week. I remember it now. It's Grace. But someday I might not. That scares me." But here I'm not just a burden. I'm Mabel. That's enough for me. Chris didn't realize he was crying until Lily climbed into his lap and wiped his cheek with her sleeve. When the video ended, Walter looked at him. "Post it," he said. "Let them hear it from us." Chris did. He uploaded it to Facebook with no caption, just the video. Within minutes it started to spread. The reactions came fast. Comments, shares, messages. This broke me. My dad has Alzheimer's. This hit home. Why aren't more people like this? Chris turned off his phone and let the story live on its own. That night, as snow drifted against the windows, Walter sat beside Aidan, sketching out plans for a wooden train set. Mabel read to Lily from a tattered children's book. Voice soft but steady. Chris stood in the hallway watching them, feeling the weight of what had just happened and what was coming next. Because kindness had made them a family, but now they had to fight to stay one. Chris sat stiffly in the back corner of the county courthouse, his hands curled into fists inside his coat pockets. The courtroom wasn't packed, but it felt heavy. The press hadn't shown up, thank God, but there were a few local reporters in the hallway hoping for a statement when it was over. Word had traveled fast. Walter and Mabel sat quietly beside him. Mabel clutched a worn handkerchief in her lap, folding it over and over. Walter's expression was unreadable, though his leg bounced in tight, rhythmic bursts beneath the bench. Across the room, Eric sat at the petitioner's table in a navy suit, his lawyer beside him. He didn't look at Chris. He didn't look at his parents. He scrolled his phone until the bailiff barked, "All rise." Judge Monroe entered stern-faced and unsmiling. She was the kind of judge who didn't need to speak loudly to command a room. Her presence did the work for her. "You may be seated," she said. Papers rustled as everyone complied. The hearing wasn't a trial yet, but it was the start of something that could change everything. Eric's lawyer opened with a composed, almost rehearsed tone. "My client is here today, not to create a spectacle, but to ensure the safety and well-being of his elderly parents, both of whom are in declining health. While we recognize the good intentions of Mr. Bennett, the fact remains that no legal guardianship has been established, and my client, as the sole legal next of kin, has the right to act on their behalf in matters of housing, medical care, and safety." Chris clenched his jaw. Walter didn't move. The judge turned to Walter. "Mr. Green, would you like to respond?" Walter stood slowly. His voice, though soft, carried across the room. "Your Honor, my wife and I are not wards of the state. We are not mentally incompetent. We are not missing. We were left behind, forgotten. And if not for Mr. Bennett, we might not be here to speak at all." Eric's lawyer interjected. "Mr. Green has acknowledged his wife suffers from cognitive decline." "She does," Walter said plainly. "But she still knows when she's loved, when she's safe. And she knows that Eric, our son, abandoned us. That's not decline. That's memory." The judge looked to Mabel. "Mrs. Green, are you aware of the nature of this hearing?" Mabel nodded slowly. "My son wants to move us again, but not for us, for himself, because he's embarrassed. Do you feel you are being coerced by Mr. Bennett in any way?" Mabel looked over at Chris, then back to the judge. He didn't ask for this. None of this. He just opened his door. Eric finally spoke. "They don't know what's best for them anymore." Chris stood. "Permission to speak, Your Honor." Judge Monroe raised an eyebrow, then nodded. Chris took a breath. "I'm not a lawyer. I'm not family. I'm not even a particularly good man most days. But I know what I saw. I saw two people left out in the cold. Literally. On Christmas Eve. I didn't bring them into my home because of some plan. I brought them in because I couldn't not do something, and I don't regret it. He looked at Eric. "But I do regret that this is what it's come to." Eric shook his head and whispered something to his lawyer. Chris turned back to the judge. "I know what the law says. I'm asking what your conscience says." The judge tapped her pen against the bench, thoughtful. "I'll review the statements and medical documentation," she said finally. "A formal evaluation of Mrs. Green's cognitive function will be conducted within the week. Until then, no action will be taken regarding removal from Mr. Bennett's home." She rapped the gavel once. "Court is adjourned." Chris exhaled for the first time in what felt like an hour. But as they left the courthouse, Eric brushed past him, voice low but sharp. "This isn't over." Chris didn't respond. He didn't need to. Back home, the house was quiet. The kids were with their neighbor, Ms. Bellamy, who had offered to watch them during the hearing. Walter went straight to the garage. Chris let him go. He knew that silence, the need to work something with your hands when everything else felt beyond reach. Mabel sat in the kitchen with a mug of tea, staring at the steam like it held answers. "You did good in there," Chris said gently. "I said what I had to," she replied. "Don't know if it'll be enough." Chris sat down across from her. "You sure you're up for an evaluation?" She nodded. "It's not about passing some test. It's about showing I'm not invisible yet." He looked down, then back up at her. "You're not." She smiled, tired but firm. Outside, the snow began again. Later that evening, Chris got a message from Tracy. "He's escalating. Just a heads up, his lawyer's trying to freeze access to their bank accounts. Says they're being manipulated. You might want to talk to a legal aid rep." Chris replied with a simple thanks. Then he put the phone down and sighed. He didn't want to play this game. But Eric wasn't backing down. And like it or not, they were in it now. Aiden came into the kitchen holding the latest birdhouse painted navy blue with tiny stars dotted across the roof. "Walter said it's the night sky," he said. "He let me do the stars." Chris took it gently. "It's beautiful. He said we could build a feeder next, for spring." Chris looked at him. "You like working with him?" Aiden shrugged. "He listens. Doesn't talk over me." Chris pulled his son into a hug. "I'm proud of you, buddy." Aiden nodded against his chest. "Are they going to leave?" Chris didn't answer right away. "We're going to do everything we can to make sure they stay. But it might get harder before it gets better." Aiden pulled back. "I hope the judge listens." "Me too," Chris said. The woman from Adult Protective Services arrived 2 days after the hearing. Her name was Lydia Coleman, a middle-aged social worker with sharp eyes and a clipboard that never left her hand. She was polite, efficient, and clearly exhausted from years of walking into messy situations and trying to make sense of them within the narrow margins of policy. Chris opened the door before she knocked. "Ms. Coleman." "Yes, you're Mr. Bennett." "That's right." "Come on in." She stepped inside, giving the house a quick but thorough scan, as if she were already taking mental inventory. Clean kitchen, lived-in living room, a faint smell of wood polish and cinnamon. A child's backpack hung on a hook. A folded quilt draped over the arm of the couch. No signs of neglect. But no matter how welcoming the home was, Chris could feel her distance. She wasn't here for tea. She was here to evaluate. Mabel sat at the kitchen table, hairbrushed lipstick lightly applied. She wore a blue cardigan and a string of pearls Chris hadn't seen her put on before. Walter sat beside her, stiff as stone. Lydia nodded toward them. "Mind if I start with a few questions?" "Not at all," Walter said. Chris stepped back, letting her work. He made himself busy in the kitchen, wiping down a perfectly clean counter just to stay close. Lydia turned to Mabel first. "Can you tell me your full name?" "Mabel Green." "And your date of birth?" "March 4th, 1949. Lydia nodded, scribbled something down. "Do you know where you are right now? I'm in the home of Christopher Bennett," Mabel said clearly. "In Ashton, Idaho. Why are you staying here?" Mabel didn't hesitate. "Because my son left us at a bus stop in the middle of winter. Chris brought us in when no one else would." "And has he ever asked you for money documentation or made you feel pressured in any way?" "No," she said firmly. Lydia turned to Walter. "Do you agree with everything your wife just said?" "I do," he said. "And I'd like it on record that this is not a case of elder abuse. It's a case of elder rescue." Lydia raised an eyebrow but didn't comment. She moved on to a series of memory exercises with Mabel word associations, short-term recall, a simple clock drawing. Mabel's hands trembled a little, but she held her own. She forgot one word in a 5-item recall, but Lydia only blinked. When it was done, Lydia gave them a tight-lipped smile. "I'll file a report within 72 hours. Until then, I'm not allowed to comment on findings." Walter leaned in. "Can I ask something? Just one thing." "Of course," she said. "Do you believe us?" Lydia's expression softened slightly, but only just. "It's not about belief, Mr. Green. It's about process." Chris followed her to the door afterward. "I'm trying to do what's right," he said. "Not just for them. For my kids, too. This is their home. They've built something real with Walter and Mabel." Lydia looked at him. "You seem like a good man, Mr. Bennett. But this isn't always about what feels right. It's about what's provable." Chris sighed. "The system says protect the vulnerable. Then why does it make them feel like criminals?" Lydia didn't answer. She just walked to her car and drove off, leaving more silence than resolution behind. That night, Chris called Miles again. "Any news from your end?" Miles sounded more tired than usual. "Nothing good. Eric's pushing hard behind the scenes. Rumor is he's calling in favors, trying to get a judge reassigned, challenging the legitimacy of the evaluation. Can he do that if he throws enough money around, maybe? I've seen it happen before." Chris rubbed his forehead. "We've done everything right. I know. Doesn't mean the system's gonna see it that way." Chris walked into the garage, needing space. Walter and Aiden had left their tools out after another birdhouse session, this one shaped like a little red schoolhouse. Chris ran his hand across the freshly cut wood. It felt solid, intentional, a thing built to last. He wanted that for all of them. He wanted something that would hold. The next morning, the newspaper hit the porch with a louder thud than usual. Chris picked it up, flipping it over absently, then stopped. "Local man accused of elder exploitation." After viral post, his stomach dropped. Below the headline was a blurry photo of Chris helping Walter into his truck taken from across the street. Out of context, it looked almost clinical, like transport, like removal. The article quoted anonymous sources close to the Green family, who raised concerns about the nature of Walter and Mabel's living situation. Eric wasn't named directly, but it was clear who was pulling the strings. Chris felt a rage rising in his chest, not just for himself, but for Walter, for Mabel, for the way good things were always twisted when power got involved. He brought the paper inside and laid it on the table. Walter read it without expression. Mabel turned it over without reading a word. "I don't need the paper to tell me where I belong," she said. That evening, Tracy called. "I tried to stop it," she said. "He's spiraling. He's convinced you're making him look like the bad guy." "He did that all on his own," Chris replied. "He's working with a private investigator now," Tracy added. "Be careful. They're not just going to play legal. They're going to play dirty." Chris hung up and sat in the quiet for a long time. He knew the next steps wouldn't be simple. Chris didn't see it coming, not the knock, not the badge, and not the sinking feeling in his chest when the word investigation came out of the officer's mouth. It was Thursday morning. The house smelled like cinnamon rolls. Aiden was getting his shoes on for school. Lily was halfway through her cereal, humming a song under her breath. Walter and Mabel had just settled in the den, flipping through a photo album Mabel had found in one of the boxes Chris stored for them. Then came the knock. Chris opened the door to find two officers. One male, one female. Plainclothes, serious eyes. "Mr. Bennett," the woman asked. "Yeah. I'm Detective Monroe. This is Detective Hanley. We're here regarding a report filed involving possible elder endangerment and financial manipulation." Chris blinked. "What we'd like to ask you a few questions. Can we come in?" His heart pounded, but he nodded and stepped aside. Sure, the detectives were professional, not aggressive, but their presence filled the room like a storm front. They asked about Timeline's medical paperwork, whether Walter and Mabel had wills, whether Chris had access to any of their finances. He answered every question truthfully. He didn't hide anything. But still the feeling crawled up his spine like a warning. Walter entered the kitchen halfway through the questioning. "Is there a problem, officers?" he asked. Detective Hanley turned to him. "We've received concerns that you and your wife may be under coercion." Walter's jaw clenched. "Is this from my son? I'm not at liberty to discuss the source," Hanley replied carefully. Walter stepped forward. "Listen, we're not confused. We're not hostages. And if anyone is manipulating anything, it's the man who left his mother in the cold." The room froze. The detectives took a beat, then asked if they could speak to Mabel privately. Walter bristled. "Why, she's not a criminal. It's protocol," Monroe said. Chris nodded. "We'll go in the other room." He and Walter stepped out, leaving Mabel at the table, clutching her cardigan like it might come apart in her hands. Chris and Walter stood in the hallway listening. "I hate this," Walter said through clenched teeth. "All of it. Every time we start to breathe again, he finds a new way to take the air out of the room." Chris leaned against the wall. He's throwing every stone he can find, hoping one breaks something. After 15 minutes, the detectives left. They didn't say much, just that they'd be in touch. Mabel looked shaken. "He kept asking if I knew where my medicine was. If Chris ever told me not to call anyone. Why would I ever say yes to that?" Chris sat beside her. "You did fine. They were just looking for red flags." "Well," she muttered, "I hope they choked on the white ones." Later that day, Chris received an email from his boss. Subject, "Let's talk." He stared at it for a long time before clicking. "Hey, Chris. We've gotten a few calls from community members about the story going around. You're not in trouble, but we'd like to meet about optics." "Can you come in tomorrow, optics?" The word turned his stomach, as if caring for someone being human had a PR consequence now. He wrote back, "I'll be there." That night after dinner, Aiden found Chris in the garage, sitting on the edge of the workbench. "Is it true?" he asked. Chris looked up. "Is what true? They think you're doing something bad?" Chris hesitated. "Some people do, not everyone." Aiden stared at the floor. "They're wrong." Chris smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I know." Aiden sat beside him. "Walter showed me how to make dovetail joints today. Said they're stronger than nails because they lock together." Chris looked at him. "That's true. Is that like us?" Chris blinked. "What do you mean, you and me?" "Us and Walter and Mabel. We lock together. We're not perfect. But we're solid, right?" Chris swallowed. "Yeah, buddy, we're solid." Aiden leaned against his arm. "Good. I don't want them to leave." Chris put his arm around his son and held him there. They sat in silence, surrounded by wood shavings, a half-finished project, and something deeper neither of them could name. The next morning, at the school drop-off, Ms. Bellamy pulled Chris aside. "I got a call," she said. "Some guy asking if Aiden was safe at home. Wanted to know if I'd noticed anything off." Chris's stomach dropped. Did he say who he was? But I got the feeling he wasn't just a nosy neighbor. Chris clenched his fists. "He's dragging my kids into this now." Ms. Bellamy touched his arm. "Don't let him rattle you. Everyone who knows you, we see what's real." He thanked her, but the knot in his chest didn't loosen. After lunch, Walter surprised Chris with an idea. "I want to speak publicly," he said. Chris looked up from the sink. "We already did the video." "No. I mean a town forum. I want people to see us in person. Hear the truth without a filter." Chris hesitated. "Are you sure it might draw more fire?" Walter nodded. "Then let it. Fire reveals what's real." That evening, Chris posted a single message online: "Walter Green will speak at the Ashton Community Hall Friday night. All are welcome." It spread quickly. Some liked it, some laughed at it, but most just said they'd be there. Chris stood on the back porch that night, staring out at the snowy yard. Tracy called. "He's angry," she said. "He's pulling records, looking for something, anything to spin against you." Chris sighed. "Of course he is. He's trying to win by exhaustion, break you before the truth settles in." "He doesn't get to win," Chris said quietly. "Not this time." There was a long pause on the line. "I wish I had the courage to stand up to him like you are." Chris looked back at the warm lights inside the house, where Walter was helping Lily make paper snowflakes, and Mabel was gently brushing Aiden's hair with surprising focus. "You've got it," he said. "You just haven't had a reason yet." Chris hung up and stepped inside. He wasn't going anywhere. Chris stood at the back of Ashton Community Hall, his hands clenched behind him as people filtered in. It wasn't packed, but it wasn't empty either. Familiar faces from the diner, the hardware store, the school PTA. A mix of curiosity, concern, and quiet judgment lingered in the room like wood smoke. Folding chairs were set in neat rows. A small podium stood at the front with a microphone connected to a dusty PA system that crackled once every few seconds, like it wasn't sure it wanted to work tonight. Walter sat near the front, straight-backed and calm. Mabel sat beside him, her cardigan neat, her hands folded in her lap like she was waiting for church to start. Lily sat cross-legged at her feet with a coloring book. Aiden, in the second row, watched his grandpa with proud, guarded eyes. Miles arrived a few minutes before it started and clapped Chris on the back. "You good," No Chris said. "But we're here. You don't have to convince everyone. Just be real." Chris nodded. "That's all we've ever been." Walter stood and slowly made his way to the front. The crowd quieted. He looked out at the rows of neighbors' townsfolk, a few reporters in the back scribbling notes. He cleared his throat. "My name is Walter Green. You've probably seen my face in a few places you didn't expect. Or maybe you heard rumors about the old couple who showed up in town and the man who took them in." He paused. No one moved. "I want to tell you a story. It's not clean. It's not comfortable. But it's true." Chris felt his chest tighten. Walter continued. "I spent most of my life believing that if you worked hard, raised a family, and stayed out of trouble, the world would make sense. My wife and I raised a boy. We gave him everything we could. And one day he turned into someone who saw us not as parents, but as problems." He looked down at his hands. "We were moved out of our home, put on a bus, promised a fresh start. That start ended with us sitting on a bench in 20-degree weather, with no coat, no plan, and no phone call coming. A murmur moved through the crowd. Chris watched fists still clenched, breath tight in his throat. Chris Bennett didn't know us, Walter said. But he saw us, and he made a decision most people wouldn't. He opened his home. He looked directly at Chris, then back at the room. He didn't do it for views or praise or some viral story. He did it because it was the right thing. And I'm standing here today because of that choice. Someone in the back coughed. A chair creaked. Walter's voice softened. We're not perfect. I know Mabel's mind doesn't always hold what it used to, but she knows when she's safe. She knows when she's loved. He turned toward the crowd again. What I don't understand is how doing the right thing became something that needs defending. Why a man who protected two vulnerable people now has to stand here and prove he's not a criminal. A woman in the back, Dee the florist, spoke up. That's because the system doesn't know what to do with kindness anymore. Heads nodded. Walter took a shaky breath. Sometimes telling the truth means ripping your own heart out in front of strangers. But I'd rather do that than let a lie define us. He stepped back from the mic. For a moment, no one moved. Then someone clapped. Then another. And another. Soon, the whole room was standing. Chris blinked hard, throat tight. Mabel was crying softly, clutching a tissue. Lily looked up at her concerned and hugged her leg. Chris moved to the front as Walter sat down. He didn't go to the podium. He stood just in front of it and looked at the people he'd passed in grocery store aisles, held doors for at the post office. I didn't want this, he began. Any of it. Not the headlines. Not the legal threats. Not the fear of losing something we didn't even know we were building until it was already built. He gestured toward Walter and Mabel. But if I had to choose between being quiet and being right, I'll choose right. A murmur of agreement rolled through the crowd. I have kids, Chris continued. They've learned more from Walter and Mabel in a few weeks than I could have taught them in a year. About patience, about forgiveness, about how to see someone who's hurting instead of stepping around them. He let the words land slow and honest. You all know me. You know I show up. You know I don't take shortcuts. And you know I don't lie. He looked down for a moment, then back up. Eric wants you to believe I'm manipulating his parents for attention, that I'm exploiting them. But all I've done is let them live. Fully. With dignity. He paused, his voice tightening. Don't let money and ego rewrite this story. Not here, not in this town. Someone called out. We got your back, Chris. Others followed with quiet affirmations. Chris stepped down. The tension in the room shifted, not erased, but realigned. Afterward, people lined up. Some shook Walter's hand, others hugged Mabel. A few handed Chris envelopes, notes, gift cards, baked goods. But what mattered most were the words. Thank you. You did the right thing. We see you. One older man leaned in and whispered to Chris. My daughter tried to put me in a home 2 years ago. I ran. You gave me hope, man. Chris nodded, overwhelmed. Later outside the hall, Chris stood under the cold night sky, staring up at the stars. Walter joined him. I wasn't sure what would happen in there, Walter said. Neither was I. Walter looked out across the snowy street. You think it's enough? Chris shrugged. It has to be. Walter smiled faintly. I hope so, because next Eric's coming with lawyers. Chris didn't flinch. Then we'll meet them, together. Walter placed a hand on Chris's shoulder. The courtroom was colder than Chris expected. Not just the air, but the mood. Sterile, clinical. A place where facts were weighed more than feelings, where lives were reduced to affidavits and cross-examinations. Chris sat beside Walter and Mabel at the respondents' table. his hands resting on a legal pad covered in notes he probably wouldn't get to read. Miles sat on his other side, checking his tablet, calm but focused. Across the aisle, Eric sat with his high-priced attorney, lean, and pressed in a designer suit that stood out like a sore thumb in small-town Idaho. His expression was smug, practiced, like someone who already believed the outcome was his. Judge Monroe entered and took her seat with the same quiet authority she carried in the earlier hearing. She adjusted her glasses and looked at the court. This is a continuation of case number 4572 Green v. Bennett, concerning legal guardianship and care of Walter and Mabel Green. The clerk called the first witness, Eric. He walked to the stand like a man entering a boardroom, not a courtroom. When he was sworn in, he smiled slightly, like the words didn't apply to him. His lawyer started soft. Mr. Green, can you explain your relationship with your parents? Eric nodded, looking somber. I'm their only child. I've supported them financially for years. I moved them from our family home to a more manageable situation for their safety and comfort. And why are you petitioning for guardianship now? Eric gave a practiced sigh. Because they're not safe. They're living with a man they barely know, who has no medical training, no legal authority, and who's been manipulating public opinion to make himself look like a hero. This isn't about love. It's about control. Chris bit the inside of his cheek, holding back the urge to interrupt. Eric's lawyer leaned in. Do you believe your parents are capable of making decisions for themselves? No, Eric said without hesitation. My mother has clear signs of dementia. My father is grieving, confused, emotionally vulnerable. They need professional care, not internet sympathy. Thank you, the lawyer said. No further questions. Miles stood. Mr. Green, how often did you visit your parents before December? Eric hesitated. I live in Portland. I was busy with work. So how often? Once every few months. And before placing them on a bus on Christmas Eve, did you have alternative care arranged? I told them I'd meet them. My schedule changed. Miles walked slowly. Your schedule changed. So instead, you had two elderly people, one with cognitive issues, wait in freezing weather with no clear destination. Eric's jaw twitched. I called them. I explained, you didn't show up. I had a meeting. You abandoned them. Objection. Eric's lawyer barked. Argumentative. Judge Monroe raised a hand. Sustained. Rephrase. Miles nodded. Did you provide any shelter, transport, or backup plan when you failed to meet your parents? Eric shifted. No. But no further questions. Miles cut in, returning to the table. Chris caught Walter's eye and gave a slight nod. It was time. Walter walked to the stand with a cane, slower than usual but deliberate. After being sworn in, he folded his hands. Miles stood. Mr. Green, do you feel safe living with Mr. Bennett? Yes. Absolutely. Has he ever coerced you or your wife? No. He respects us. He listens. He treats us like human beings, not burdens. What happened on Christmas Eve? Walter's voice was clear, resolute. We were told to meet Eric. We waited. He never came. No explanation, no apology, just silence. And Mr. Bennett. He brought us inside. No questions, no conditions, just warmth. That's what saved us. Eric's lawyer stood. Mr. Green, are you aware that your son has power of attorney over certain accounts? I revoked that. After what he did, I had every right. You're angry. Isn't it possible your judgment is clouded? Walter looked straight at the lawyer. Anger doesn't erase truth. No further questions. Next, Mabel was called. Chris held his breath. She sat gently, hands shaking slightly. Miles approached. Mrs. Green, do you know where you are today? In court, she said. Trying to stay with my family. Do you remember what happened on Christmas Eve? Her brow furrowed, but she nodded. My son didn't come. I was cold. I remember being cold and scared. Then I remember soup and kindness. Who gave you kindness? She smiled at Chris. He did. Has he ever harmed you? No. Ever pressured you? Never. Eric's lawyer stood. Mrs. Green, do you ever forget things? Yes, she admitted. Sometimes I lose names, days, but I remember how people make me feel. And how does Mr. Bennett make you feel? She paused, voice softer. Safe. No further questions. Chris was called last. Miles asked him simple, direct questions about taking them in, about what changed, about what they built together. Chris spoke calmly, honestly. No drama, just facts and heart. Then Eric's lawyer approached. You're not family, Mr. Bennett. No. You have no medical training, no social work background. No. You posted a video of the Greens online. Some would say that was exploiting a private matter. I posted it with their consent, and it told the truth. Truth, the lawyer echoed. You believe you've done nothing wrong? Chris looked across the room, his voice steady. I didn't do this for praise. I did it because no one else did. You didn't see them that night. I did. The lawyer turned. No further questions. Judge Monroe called a recess. The room emptied slowly. In the hallway, Chris saw Tracy waiting near the back. She hadn't spoken all day, but now she stepped forward. I want to testify, she said. Chris blinked. What? He doesn't speak for me. Not anymore. Inside, as court resumed, Miles stood. Your Honor, we have a witness who's come forward voluntarily. Tracy was sworn in, walked to the stand, and took a deep breath. I'm Eric's ex-wife, she said. I stayed silent too long. I saw how he talked about his parents, like they were weights around his neck. He said leaving them was simpler. That's the word he used. Simpler. Gasps echoed from the gallery. Tracy looked directly at Eric. You didn't lose your parents, Mr. Green, you walked away from them. There's a difference. The courtroom fell into a heavy silence after Tracy stepped down. Chris could feel the shift. The air wasn't quite as cold. The walls didn't feel so close. Something had cracked open, something that wasn't going to be shut again. Judge Monroe adjusted her glasses, her gaze sweeping across the room. I've heard enough, she said. This case, while legal in nature, is ultimately rooted in something deeper, the definition of care, of family, of choice. She paused, then looked directly at Eric. Mr. Green, you have the legal right to petition for guardianship. That is true, but legal rights do not supersede moral failures. What I've seen in this courtroom is not exploitation by a stranger, but neglect by a son. Eric flinched. Walter and Mabel Green have demonstrated to this court's satisfaction the capacity to make their own choices. While Mrs. Green may exhibit signs of early dementia, she is still aware, articulate, and emotionally coherent. She turned to Walter and Mabel. You have the right to remain where you are with whomever you choose. Mr. Bennett is not your family by blood, but he has shown more consistency, compassion, and integrity than the person who is. Then to Chris. This court thanks you for your humanity. Case dismissed. The gavel struck once, a sound like thunder in the quiet. And just like that, it was over. But it wasn't. Because outside that courtroom, something else began. The snow had started to melt. Not much, but enough that you could see patches of brown grass poking through the blanket that had covered Ashton for weeks. Chris stood on the porch with a mug of coffee watching Lily chase Aiden with a spray bottle full of colored water painting rainbows into the snowbanks. Their laughter carried into the air warm and alive. Behind him, the screen door creaked open. Walter stepped out, holding 2 small bowls of birdseed. "Feeder's fixed," he said. Little guy knocked it sideways again. Chris took a bowl from him. "He's 10 and full of sugar. That feeder doesn't stand a chance." They walked to the edge of the yard in comfortable silence, refilling the handmade birdhouses they'd hung from the trees. Most were crooked. One leaned so far to the side, Chris had started calling it the Drunk Diner. Walter smirked at the nickname every time. "Still doesn't feel real," Walter finally said. "It is," Chris replied. "You're here. You're safe. That's real." Walter nodded, quiet. "Have you heard from him?" Chris asked. Walter shook his head. "No. And that's fine. I'm not waiting anymore. I'm living." Chris glanced over. "You ever think about leaving? You know now that everything's settled." Walter chuckled. "Leave what? My grandkids? My garage? The world's most stubborn coffee machine? Nah." Chris smiled. "Didn't think so." Back inside, Mabel was seated at the table helping Lily glue buttons onto a construction paper snowman. Her fingers moved slower than they used to, but her focus was clear. She hummed quietly a song only she seemed to remember, but it made Lily smile. Aiden sat nearby sketching blueprints for a new birdhouse. This one had 3 levels, a balcony, and a skylight. Chris leaned in. "Looks a little ambitious." Aiden grinned. "Walter said you never build small when you care a lot." Chris ruffled his hair. "Smart man." Dinner that night was simple roast chicken potatoes and a cherry pie Chris had tried and mostly failed to bake from scratch. Mabel insisted it was perfect. Walter said it tasted like effort, which Chris decided to take as a compliment. They ate at the same old table with mismatched chairs and chipped plates, but the room felt full in the best way. After the kids went to bed, Walter and Mabel lingered by the fireplace. Mabel spoke first. "You think people will remember all this?" Walter looked over. "What part? All of it? The video? The court? What we said? What we didn't?" Chris settled into the chair across from them. "I think some people already forgot. But the ones who matter, they'll remember the right parts." "Which parts are those?" Walter asked. Chris stared into the fire for a long moment before answering. "That kindness doesn't always look perfect. That family is who stays when things get hard. And that nobody's too old, too broken, or too late to be loved right." Mabel smiled. "I like that." Walter leaned back with a satisfied sigh. "I never thought I'd end up here." After everything, Chris looked at them, voice low. "Neither did I. But I'm glad you did." Spring came slowly to Ashton. Snow gave way to mud, mud gave way to green. The porch railing needed repainting. The old shed out back collapsed during a windstorm and had to be torn down. Chris and Walter rebuilt it over 3 weekends. Aiden helped. Lily painted daisies on the side panels. Mabel sat in a lawn chair sipping lemonade and shouting opinions. They planted a garden, tomatoes, peppers. One zucchini plant that grew like it was on a mission to take over the yard. They didn't talk much about the court anymore, or about Eric. But sometimes Chris would catch Walter looking at the phone like he expected it to ring. And sometimes Mabel would ask if they should set an extra plate just in case. Chris never said no. He just nodded and they said it. Hope doesn't disappear. It just learns to live quieter. One evening in May, a package arrived. No note, no return address. Inside was a photo. Eric as a boy sitting between Walter and Mabel on the old porch of their home in Oregon. All 3 of them smiling like time hadn't touched them yet. Chris showed it to Walter in the kitchen. He looked at it for a long time, then placed it on the fridge with a magnet that read, "Home is who you come back to." He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. That night, as the house settled into sleep, Chris stepped outside. The stars were sharp above the air, soft and new. He stood in the quiet thinking about everything they'd survived, about the strangers who became family, the wounds that didn't go away but stopped bleeding, the kids who laughed more, the old man who built again, the woman who remembered just enough. Some stories don't end with fireworks. They end with a porch light left on, a bowl of seeds refilled, a pie baked, burned, and shared anyway. He exhaled deep and full. This wasn't the life he expected. It was better. Because the truth is, love doesn't need permission. It just needs a place to land. And here, finally, it had one.